turning out on this rather grey January day. I hope you all managed to get something of a break over Christmas and New Year, and I hope the New Year finds you well. If you aren't already muted, could you please mute yourself? If you are able to change your display name to your name and your organisation name, and I'm just realising I haven't, then that would be great. But I am Adrian Searle, I'm Chief Executive of Oxfordshire Community Foundation, and I will be chairing today's session. We are recording the session and we do make them available on YouTube afterwards and sometimes pull clips out from the speakers so that people who can't attend can engage with some of the content of the webinars. There is a chat box, as you probably know by now. Please do use it to ask questions or make comments, and there will be time for a Q&A session at the end. Kate, if you want to pop the slides up, I will give people a little bit of background into the Oxfordshire scene with regards to isolation and loneliness. Now, as we often do, we have produced an insight report in advance of this session, which is available on our website, that looks at levels of isolation and loneliness across the county. And I know Paul is going to talk more about this in due course. But two slides I wanted to pick out that just illustrate some of the challenges we face in Oxfordshire. The first illustrates what levels of isolation there are in Oxfordshire. And now, often when we show deprivation maps or disadvantage maps in Oxfordshire, you'll see places like Blackbird Leys and Berensfield and Barton picked out. Here, this map shows that rural Oxfordshire is among the worst 20% of the country in many cases with regard to access to services. So that's critical services like a shop, a supermarket, a post office, a GP. And on that measure, our rural communities are much more isolated than our urban communities, which is unsurprising, but I think how isolated they are compared with national averages is the thing that I find quite surprising. Next slide, please, Kate. The other aspect we're talking about today, obviously, is loneliness, which is related to isolation, but not the same thing. And loneliness can be far more common in urban areas where people are much more fragmented, the sense of community and knowing your neighbours isn't as strong as it can be in rural areas. And so that tends to be more prevalent in cities and towns. And we've got maps here showing Oxford City in the middle with areas around the south and east of the city having higher levels of loneliness. Map of Banbury to the left and Didcot to the right, showing pockets of loneliness in those areas as well. There's a lot more detail on that in the report, so do download it and have a read. And I know Paul is going to talk more about isolation and loneliness in a minute. So the final slide I'd like to show, or actually the penultimate slide, is an update on our COVID response, which we've been trying to do every webinar. Now, this is, again, a fast-changing picture, but up to the end of December, we had paid out £730,000 plus in grants to local organisations. We did reopen for grant applications about 24 hours after the latest lockdown was announced. We were planning on leaving the funding round open for about a month, but unfortunately we were absolutely inundated with applications. We then had to give everyone 48 hours notice of closing the round because we were quickly going to be facing far more applications than we could possibly deal with. Closed in under a week, and we had over £400,000 worth of applications. The team have been doing an incredible job sifting through those, trying to identify those areas of greatest need. I know many people are waiting to hear back. We will be getting back to you hopefully this week, but it may slip into next week. We've had a minor case of digital exclusion in the team with one of our members' home Wi-Fi having gone down. That should be coming back up tomorrow, but that's obviously cramped our processes slightly. So I mean, I think the broad message from that is that there are massive needs out there, and if you do have a bit of money in your pocket or know someone who does, please do chip in and support local community efforts where you can, or donate into the Community Resilience Fund. We will be able to make very good use of that support. The final slide then is to highlight our speakers for the day. So we will be kicking off in a minute with Paul Cann, Chair of the Campaign to End Loneliness. After that, we will have Rita Atkinson, a trustee of the Abingdon Damascus Youth Project. Then we have Cllr Andrew McHugh, who's a councillor for Cherwell District Council, who's been very involved in initiatives around loneliness and isolation there. And then at the end, there will be an open Q&A session. So please do post your questions in the chat, or when the time comes, use the raise the hand facility if you want to ask a question. So I would like to, well, it gives me great pleasure actually to be able to introduce Paul Cann. As many of you will know, I worked with Paul Cann some years ago at Age UK Oxfordshire when he was chief exec there, and he was at that time he was then involved in this wonderful initiative, the Campaign to End Loneliness, which he was one of the co-founders of, and is now chair of today. And I know he's a very passionate and very eloquent speaker. So I think without further ado, I would like to hand over to Paul to talk about loneliness and isolation. Paul.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Good afternoon, everybody. I was wondering how I could introduce myself to you, and I thought I'd do it very briefly from reading the badge that I'm wearing, which says, I tried to form a gang, but it turned into a book club. And that really is the story of my life so far. I want to congratulate the foundation on the long-standing commitment that they've had and involvement in the work around isolation and loneliness. And I just want to give you a very brief perspective on what the writer Olivia Laing calls the lonely city that we all live in. And I'm working from the academic definition, which I paraphrase as being a painful gap in your life between the quality and quantity of contacts you have and the quality and quantity of contacts you want. Loneliness, distinct concept from isolation, solitude, and living alone. But of course, there are many overlaps. And fundamentally, loneliness relates to an evolutionary instinct that we all have as human beings to connect. As the late great Professor John Cacioppo has showed in all his work, we have this impulse to seek out others, and loneliness is that hunger, that ache when we don't fulfill that. There are particular risk groups, of course, and there are particular types, but we're all there. And the Campaign to End Loneliness coincidentally started by 4 directors in older people's charities, but we absolutely affirm the common cause with younger people, and indeed with campaigns to highlight loneliness in younger ages, such as the one the Co-op Foundation is leading, called Lonely, Not Alone. I mean, I'm as concerned for the potential loneliness of, for example, a young mother spending long hours alone with small children, like my daughter, or young men working in lockdown in a flat with no garden, like my son. And of course, one of the major strategies for connection has to be to bring younger and older people together. And we'll hear more about that, I believe, from Rita of Abingdon, Damascus. We'd like to think that the campaign has grown over 10 years to look more like, or increasingly like, a movement of people who share this passion. And we recognize, of course, that very sadly, the issue of loneliness was given greater energy still through tragedy in the shape of the murder of the MP Joe Cox in 2016, who was a great champion of work on loneliness. But now we have a loneliness strategy. We've had it for a couple of years, and it has 60 action points in it, which the government this week has reported on. Fresh off the press, it's produced a report saying what it's done to move its loneliness strategy forward. And it does now major in on 3 particular areas around how can we reduce stigma through awareness campaigns, like their own led campaign, Let's talk about loneliness, making loneliness a core issue in all organisations and all policies, secondly, and thirdly, building on what is a surprisingly limited evidence base. And what we have to do, I think, is whether it's about the social context or about health and biology, about communities and how communities work together, whether it's just about what works to reduce loneliness. And I'm using that phrase advisedly because the campaign has now merged with the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. I hope we're always listening. Could we have the next slide, please, Kate? We ran webinars last year, which were attended by hundreds of organisations across the UK, which were working in the area of loneliness and isolation. And we're about to publish this report, Lessons from Lockdown, from our website. So I'd just like to very briefly refer to what the report was about. And of course, as you all know from your own everyday practice and the work you do to champion issues like this, there's a huge amount of common ground. First of all, when COVID came along, we saw what was always there, but the reality got even worse. Inequality, physical isolation, frustration. Housebound older people remained housebound. Young people with mental health problems still struggled, and even more so. In fact, young people recorded the highest rates of feeling lonely in lockdown. And I wonder whether this was due to the shock to the system of the disruption from perhaps a more normal lifestyle permitted for young people. Perhaps older people have been more accustomed to being isolated and stuck and bored. I just asked that question, but at least there was now a spotlight shining. So we focused on the who, how, and what of tackling loneliness during COVID. And the who is very much about finding and making real effort to find and focus on those groups most at risk. For example, those who are shielded, those who have mobility problems, those, if we can find them, who are on a kind of downward spiral. And for this, I do believe that the analytical tools that Adrian was showing us are enormously helpful in guiding us to where we need to make even more effort. But for which it's the very local groups and the local key people closest to their communities who I think perhaps make the biggest difference. And this word hyper-local. And I'm thinking here particularly of Oxfordshire's 70 or so good neighbour schemes, but there will be many others, and I'm sure you're leading some of them. On the how, it was the critical importance here of access to help and opportunity. There are huge barriers of physical access, just how you get to places. A continuing big problem of digital access, which for many saw some wonderful opportunities and lots of help. But for many on low income or in later life, it remains an area of big exclusion. And then the psychological barriers that exist and were amplified in COVID of low confidence and nervousness. So turning to the what, it became clear that checking in on someone is fine, but meaningful contact, actual relationships is what people craved. And there is no standard answer to that, as you know. I particularly advocate the value of creative arts, taking part in singing or dancing or something like that, as an avenue out of loneliness. But there is no standard answer, and there are as many answers to the question of what helps people deal with loneliness as there are people. So our work is increasingly focused on the emotional and psychological approaches we can take as individuals, to how we feel better able to cope. And we've recently produced reports about promising approaches to tackling loneliness and psychological strategies for loneliness. Everybody talked about how there was so much more demand, how they had to change their service model, how much it was costing more, and the need to find volunteers, but also hang on to them. Could we have the next slide? Okay. So I just want to finish with 5 takeouts from that series, but also from the work we've done over the years, which I think is really rich as a resource. Work done by Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Carnegie UK Trust about what makes for kinder, better connected communities. First of all, this digital, what I call chasm. It was already a glaring inequality. What is it? Between 34,000 and 43,000 people in Oxfordshire not online. I'm sure Adrian can correct me. But it got even worse for those who couldn't, join a virtual choir or do a Zoom quiz. And I worry that actually COVID saw us in retreat in our ambition, and we were falling back, understandably, on the phone. So there's been a lot of past effort, but surely we have to do better. It's all about not only kit, not only connection, but surely it's also about people's psychology, how we overcome nervousness, how we deal with attitudes, if we're to make a real dent on this huge thing. And thank goodness for the arrival of getting Oxfordshire online. I'm sure we'll hear something about that. Secondly, to back what we call the hyper-local. And my own neighbourhood scheme in Hook Norton, we know the people, we know their networks, and we're fortunate that both the Parish Council and District Council recognise this, trust us, and support us. And that's what I think these very local groups need. And maybe tiny amounts of money, really tiny amounts of money, which can make so much difference. Secondly, to change the way we behave, can we live in a kinder way? Can we encourage all of us to make that step to reach out, and a culture which embraces others? That's in a socially distanced way, of course. And fourthly, the local state, the local authority, the NHS can do an awful lot of good in terms of places and spaces, in terms of working to develop transport. It can also, I think, use this very important initiative of social prescribing to really change lives, to transform lives. And of course, by promoting intergenerational work. A national state can do a lot of harm, but it can also help. And I think the crucial thing that it can help with, I believe, is in the level of debate and the civility and the kindness that we bring to public debate. And the most eloquent voicing of that message of bringing people together through kindness. Could we have the next slide? Is of course Jo Cox herself, who said at her maiden speech, "While we celebrate our diversity, what surprises me time and time again as I travel around the constituency is that we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than the things which divide us." And that to me is the core of reaching out and sharing, which I hope you will all be involved in doing. And I just, with the last slide, perhaps to share a few contacts, a few links, if they are of help. I hope they are. And I really want to listen to what you have to say and what our presenters have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, quite poignant to see Jo Cox up there. I'm sure there's probably people in the room who knew her. She worked locally with Oxfam for a number of years and has got quite a number of connections. So yeah, powerful words, and ones that I think we should all keep in mind as we move through life. So can I invite if you have, sorry, just to say before I move on, if you have questions for Paul or any of the other speakers, do post them in the chat box, or we will have time at the end to come to them. But Rita Atkinson, if you would like to unmute yourself, it would be wonderful if you could start off by introducing yourself and Damascus.
Thank you, Adrian. Before I do that, may I just say, following on from Paul's excellent presentation, they do say that in every crisis, there's always an opportunity for good. And I think in this COVID crisis, in this pandemic, the intergenerational work has really come to the fore in helping all age groups. So that's brilliant. In terms of introducing myself, I'm a founding trustee of the Abingdon Damascus Youth Project. Damascus is, as many people know, is it the road to Syria? No, it's an acronym for 5 rural villages just south and west of Abingdon. It's Drayton, Appleford, Milton, Sutton Courtenay, and Steventon. And in 1999, through the parish churches, a group of us got together thinking we would like to support young people, but support them where they are. The idea being we would have a youth worker who would engage with young people in their own spaces, supporting them. We have come a long way since then. In 2003, we became a registered charity. And currently, what we do realize is one size doesn't fit all. Young people, just as us, as we are growing older, have complex needs. So it is about addressing the different strands of need, if you like, with young people. And the other is, when we first set up the charity, we thought, well, the day we're not needed, we will know our work has been successful. Times change and young people need support, but different kinds of support now. And we've sort of, the strands of work we do, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all and we want it to be sustainable, is we start a lot with street work, which is being out in the streets wherever young people are, literally hanging out with them, if you like, and through our staff that we employ, who are all qualified youth workers. And it's identifying the need at a very early stage so we can actually work on prevention rather than having to mitigate and manage after a vulnerable young person has got into a position where they need a lot of support. So street work is one of our main strands. Building on that, identifying needs. If a young person needs one-to-one support, we would work with them. We would liaise with all the agencies that may already be involved with them. We also pick up street conversations, so do workshops around healthy living, around awareness of substance abuse. And it's about turning those street conversations into more positive conversations amongst the young. So it's not about teaching them so they will change their lives. It's about them not bragging about whatever drug they've taken, but actually understanding from a position of knowledge that we do a lot of group work. We run youth clubs, which is about them having their own social space to perhaps practice respectful engagement that we would do. We also, from looking at the sustainable angle of it, for us it's really important that there is an ongoing cycle of young people. We're training them to be young community leaders. They're putting back into the community for the next generation. As an example, 15 years ago when we started, summer holidays, village school, vandalism was high. If a young person was climbing over the school fence to do some damage, the older ones walking by would laugh, almost to encourage them. If you ever see that happening now, you will find the older ones saying to the young one, "Oh, get off there, what are you up to?" You know, there is very much that culture change about taking responsibility. So young leaders are key. Perhaps another very important one, and it's again linking in with Paul's presentation, is providing sustainable communities, cohesive communities for young people to have, they have that proper safety net for them. And that's why intergenerational work has always been a very, very strong part of what we do. I have to say, up until the pandemic, it was more the focus on increasing the cohesion within the community so young people felt supported and recognized. What's come through within the COVID is how important it is for exactly those reasons of loneliness and isolation. And certainly young people's loneliness has really come up to the fore during this COVID crisis. So I'm rambling on a bit here, Adrian.
No, that's I think gives a really good insight. And I think you mentioned there, and I think Paul alluded to how, you know, teenage years are often the most sociable of your life. So it's having teenage children myself, I see how hard it is for them to live through lockdowns and the pandemic. And you also talked about a lot of group work and being out on the streets and running youth clubs. How have you had to adapt through lockdown because of the pandemic to in order to carry on doing the great work you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first thing to say is we've always made sure that everything is COVID secure, anything we do, and we follow whatever the National Youth Agency is wonderful. It publishes guidelines which we follow. I have to say, March last year, when we discovered we were going into lockdown, it wasn't too hard for us because young people are used to using social media. What we did was quickly develop resources that we could keep the engagement with young people for things like Instagram, they use quite a bit. We developed escape room games where actually we would put in things which involve maths and English. So there was a bit of trying to keep their study. The other thing that also we had to adapt quite quickly and did was to make sure they still try to keep a routine, because invariably the sleep times would shift from 10 o'clock at night to about 4 o'clock in the morning. So they weren't out of bed before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which means they were not linking into school in terms of the homeschooling. So we adapted a lot in terms of moving over digitally. However, we did have our list of very vulnerable youngsters, and we made sure we had day-to-day contact, either telephone or just to visit outside their house. And that's how it started off. I think as lockdown lifted, particularly the summer months last year, we were able to do more work outside. And that's also when the intergenerational work came into force as well. Even before that, we had been doing care packs. But we were fortunate and lucky to get a grant from Oxfordshire Community Foundation, as well as Sovereign, who co-funded a project that we could do an intergenerational project.
Wonderful. And you're leading it up to each question before I ask it, which is wonderful. So thinking more about that intergenerational aspects of your work, can you talk about some of the benefits both for young people and some of the older people you work with through your programs?
Okay. First of all, it's important to say for us, intergenerational is not new. We've been pre-COVID, we had regularly, young people would organise senior citizen tea parties because it is about meaningful contact, as Paul has said. They would have we would have village fates where young people and elderly would get involved in organising them. So there were lots of events where contact with elderly was quite important, as not just elderly, with adults, if I can call it that. In COVID and appreciating, I mean, for example, we had one elderly gentleman who sadly has died now, but we really feel pleased we were able to help him in his last months. His comment when we did the bingo event, which I'll talk about in a second, was, this is the first time I've got dressed in 4 months. So that was the extent of isolation and the loneliness that people were feeling. So one of the events that we did do, where I think both the young and the adults benefit tremendously, it was called Doorstep Bingo. And this was on sovereign housing land. We had young people organize bingo and call out bingos, and the elderly would sit in their bubbles outside of their housing and do it. And it proved extremely popular in all the villages in South Abingdon as well. We ran it. And I think Kate has a little clip for you to hear about, is it the young person, how they felt about it, Kate?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So this is an interview conducted by 2 of our youth workers with the young people, 2 of the young people who did a lot of the work for the project, for the bingo.
So Maddie said that she's grown in confidence and been able to gain like communication skills. Is there anything that you feel like any skills that you've picked up, Alfie?
Yeah, a bit like that, like before lockdown or whatever, I wouldn't like do lives and stuff, like I wouldn't feel like confident. But then there's like, when I started doing like my first quid, more people joined, then I felt like more confident.
That's really good. And we've also just noticed like you were a bit nervous doing the bingo calling in the first week, but then like you are belting them out now. And I must say, everyone was asking, where's Alfie the bingo caller this Monday just been? Literally everyone was like, where is he?
It wasn't quite the same without you, Al.
It wasn't.
Thank you, Kate. So as you can see, I mean, for young people, there's a tremendous boost in their confidence. There's a tremendous feeling of ownership. It's their village as well. It's not just the adults making decision for them. And so that really helps. Now, in terms of the elderly, gosh, there's so many examples we could give you, but there is a little clip we've got from this Doorstep bingo in particular. But what I would, before we play the clip, I would like to give you one example. We did a senior citizen tea party in 2019. And after that, one of the ladies came up and said she'd overheard the young people say, I didn't know old people could be such fun. So it's really trying to bridge that gap, increase that understanding. And here we have a clip, Kate, from an elderly lady on her reaction after the bingo. And if I could just describe the scene there, so you can see the flats. They were called old people's flats colloquially, but they're actually open to all residents. And as you can see in the photograph, the groups of adults sitting in bubbles, if you like, and you can see the young people there who, in the top one, who are calling out the numbers.
How do intergenerational activities such as Doorstep Bingo help the elderly in the community?
Well, it gets us out away from the house a little bit, which we wouldn't do otherwise. Well, what I really liked about it was getting to know the young people. When I've been in the village, some of the young people have come up and spoken to me, and I feel that is really nice. Yeah.
And that's really nice. So it's helped you to build a bond with another aspect of your community.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that's really good to hear, actually.
Thank you, Kate. I hope that's been able to convey a little bit, at least, of how important intergenerational work is.
That's been fantastic, Rita. Thank you so much. Can I just apologise for the window cleaners behind me? It's an incredible timing. Just a quick final question, Rita. I mean, you've shared so much rich learning and knowledge and experience from Damascus. Are there any? I know there's other people on the call who work with young people who do intergenerational work. Are there any key lessons from lockdown that Abingdon, Damascus have learned that you would like to share with us?
I think we certainly feel we want to increase our emphasis rather than it just being one of the many strands of our work. It's bringing it out more to the fore, because I think it's important to recognise most youth work we see within communities, and it's absolutely no criticism of that, but they tend to be such that the youth work is done in isolation from the rest of the community. So it's almost like youth work community is a community within a community. And I think the intergenerational engagement and a focus on it really helps leave something behind when that project can no longer run there. So that sustainability aspect of it, I think, is important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rita. And do stick around, because I know I've seen comments popping up, and I'm sure there will be some questions we'll want to come back to you with in due course. For our final speaker, could I invite Andrew McHugh to unmute yourself and say a few words about who you are and the role you have in Cherwell District Council with a focus on health and well-being.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, as you've heard, I'm a Cherwell District Councillor. I haven't been a councillor for very long, but I'm the lead member for health and well-being. I'm also the chairman of the Oxfordshire Health Improvement Board and chairman of the Oxfordshire Tobacco Control Alliance. So loneliness, as as part of a preventative strategy for health is really important for me.
Excellent. And we were talking about this in the kind of pre-meeting before people came in, but could you tell us a bit about what you think the key things people can do to improve their own well-being are?
Well, yes. Before I go on, actually, there are a couple of things I do want to say, and this does go to the heart of it. Rita mentioned something about never letting a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's so important. We've seen this crisis has brought out the best in people. Right at the start, we had, what was it, nearly 750,000 people step forward to become volunteers. If we can capture that community spirit and direct it, you know, we can do an awful lot. And Paul, what you said, you know, bringing up Joe Cox, and you mentioned kindness. If we could, all of us, decide when we leave here today, just to be kinder to the people we meet. Interestingly, I tried to introduce this into Cherwell District Council and would smile at people and say good morning to them, and it got very alarmed. But Adrian, you said, what can we do to improve loneliness? One of the nothing I'm going to say today is original. It does come from a very good book that I recommend to everybody, Staying Alive by Dr. Phil Hammond. He writes for Private Eye, and you'll have seen him on the television. Very good guy. But he says that in order to look after, to stay healthy, we need to start to enjoy our own company more. And one of the things he suggests that we do that is to drop clangers every day. There we are, a clanger. Does everybody know what these are? Delightful little woolen toys that speak like swanny whistles. But actually, for me, clangers is how we should live our life. And it will help us to enjoy life better and to actually become less dependent on the NHS and more dependent on what we can do for ourselves and what we can do for others. So going through clangers, the first C is connect. And as Paul said, and as Rita has said, we're social animals. We have a need to join together with other people. But unfortunately, that's become very difficult during lockdown. You know, we're in lockdown 3 at the moment. But we are a very inventive animal as well. And we've come up with ways around this. I mean, I've made a note, Doorstep bingo. I hope there's no copyright on that because I'm going to use that. But we have Zoom meetings, we have Zoom quizzes. But what this has highlighted is digital exclusion. Now I'm thinking, I'm going to mention their names. Within my village, there is a delightful couple in their 80s, Brian and Christine. Now they've both got a spring in their step. They're both well connected. They would always be at the pub on a Friday night, but they would have nothing to do with mobile phones, and computers were a closed book to them. And so immediately lockdown came, they are excluded. We have regular meetings on Zoom, we have regular village quizzes, but people like Brian and Christine are excluded. But what I'm really pleased to be able to say, in my role, actually, the great thing about my role is I get to meet a lot of great people doing great work. And Pat Coomer-Wood at Banbury Citizens Advice Bureau has got a great project called Connect, where she recognizes that a lot of people like Brian and Christine probably have the digital infrastructure within their own houses, but don't know that you can have a Zoom call, a FaceTime using a mobile phone. And so Pat is working with volunteers to go out in a COVID secure way to bring information technology to the elderly, to the isolated. So that's great. One of the other things that she did over Christmas was festive friends, where volunteers would go and have a chat with the elderly, the isolated, the lonely across their the garden gate. And for some of them, they were saying this was the first person that they had spoken to in 4 months, you know, and that's terrible. There's also social prescribing. One of the things Phil Hammond says in his book is that lives are for living, not for medicalizing. The problem is, if a patient goes to a GP with loneliness, which leads to depression, what can the GP do? Medicalize it and give antidepressants. But, and I think it was Paul, you mentioned social prescribing. Social prescribing is now coming online. And talking to Pat this morning, she's had a meeting with 30 people who are going out to deliver social prescribing. But having been involved in this in the past, part of the problem, and again, I'm still on the sea of clangers, I'll move on quickly after this, is that when people become lonely, they build a barrier around themselves. And it's one thing to say, how about coming to a dance class? How about going to Men in Sheds? But when the day comes, it's very difficult for the person to actually get up and go. And so you need almost somebody to come in and say, come on, out of the chair, coat on, to get people to turn their face from the wall to society again. So that's C, we're social, we need to connect. The next one is L. A lot of people, a lot of young people think that as soon as they leave school, learning's done, but we need to learn. And your brain is like a muscle. It needs to be trained and you need to keep training it every day. And so the challenge is learn a new fact, learn a new poem, but learn something new every day. And then A, active. We can all be more active. I'm really pleased to see that Adrian is standing up. Actually, chairs are the work of the devil. If we stand up, we could, we would all be an awful lot healthier, less sitting down. In fact, for those of you who've met Muir Gray, one of his suggestions is that we should, all of us, be doing the number of press-ups of our age every day. I'm afraid I got stuck as a 5-year-old. So the next thing is N, and notice. And this is about turning away from looking into yourself and looking out. We live in a beautiful world. There's an awful lot. I mean, one of the greatest joys I have, I've been tamed by a blackbird who comes to my back door, and demands that I feed him sultanas. And to actually notice the things on that blackbird. I'd never noticed that they have little feathers that stick outwards from their beak. But I recommend just trying to notice what's going on around you. I mean, mentioned doorstep bingo, there's also bird spot bingo. You can sit at your window and look out and have 5 birds and tick them off as you go. So noticing. It's also, we live in Banbury, we have some of the most spectacular murmurations of starlings. And to be able to sit there at dusk and watch this happening, it lifts your spirits. And that's what I'm saying about being able to enjoy your own company as well. So there's noticing. And then G, give back. There's a lot of research to show that people who are generous, not necessarily with money, sorry about that, Adrian, but
time is good too. And I am going to have to ask you to speed up. I could listen happily all day, but just to give time for questions.
No, that's fine. Okay. So give back, volunteer. It'll make you better and it'll help the people you help as well. Then finally, we've got the last 3, eat, and eat well, eat healthily, fewer biscuits, more vegetables, more fruit, more fiber, and then rest. To take time, to sit down, to look out, to see the birds, smell the flowers, and then sleep, and good quality sleep. And if you do that, and if you drop your clangers every day, you will be healthier and the people around you will enjoy your company. But be kind and smile. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. That's wonderful. And if anyone's got a Swanee whistle and wants to entertain us with us, then that'd be great to hear later. And quickly, Andrew, if I could just ask you, I know you've been a very passionate supporter and heavily involved in the Age Friendly Banbury project, trying to create an age-friendly community in Banbury. Could you just say a bit about why you think that's so important and the work there?
Well, I think it comes back to what Rita was saying about intergenerational contact. But it's one of the things I didn't mention was healthy place shaping, that we need to make our town centres, our villages, friendly for people of age. I mean, and there are things that we can do with that to make sure, for instance, that the street furniture, fancy name for street benches, are probably no more than 200 metres apart, so that people with limited mobility can do that. We've got a great scheme which is going in Banbury. Unfortunately, that lockdown has got in the way, where people would sign up to this saying that they would make their staff loos available to the elderly, because that's one of the things that puts people off, you know, oh, I'm not going to be able to get to the... So, yeah, it's really important. We've, the elderly, by definition, have given a lot of their life to the world around them, and we need to give them the respect of doing what we can to make towns friendly.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Now, I know we've had a very lively chat. I haven't been able to follow all the conversations, but Kate Parinder, do you want to prime the first question?
Yes. We've got an interesting question here from Dr. Ruth Allen. She's asking about whether there's any research into different types of loneliness for different ages, so that interventions can be tailored properly to different age groups. I wonder if Paul might have an answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more about interventions in respect of older people than there is in relation to younger people. There's a whole list that I could give, Ruth, of leading academics who have looked at the different things that happen that work for making people feel less lonely. What I would generalize by saying is that throughout life we have transitions. From leaving school till the end of our lives, we have points that are transitioning to something, and they are points of opportunity, but they're also hazards. And I think particularly there's been quite a lot of work done on bereavement, which to me is a major transition point and a major risk of loneliness point. And we know from evidence that giving people some ability to renew is crucial, and that has been carried forward as an example by Age UK Oxfordshire with its late spring programme for people who have been widowed. And there's lots of evidence about things like that. The themes that come back from all the research include give people agency, give them a sense of purpose and a sense of value at whatever age and stage you're at. Making an intervention two-way rather than, you know, recipient giver, making it two-way, as we've heard described. I mean, I think, you know, Hooky Neighbours, we're doing a lot of letter writing, but the young people from Chipping Norton School are doing a lot of other things. And I think the third main theme I pull out is find fulfillment that works for people. That might be going and exercising, going running. I believe Oxford has now got a wonderful thing called Good Gym, younger people going out in running clubs and connecting with older people, but find the fulfillment that can often come through intergenerational work. So I think those are some of the main themes from the different research, but I'd be very happy to talk to Ruth in more detail after that.
Thank you, Paul. There is a good gym in Oxford, and one of the things they were doing through lockdown was delivering medication to people who needed it, which meant they could go out for their run and do something good whilst out and about as well.
I just quickly, Paul, thank you for that. But I myself have a personal story, because my mum lost her husband back in 2018, and she was going through the grieving process, obviously my dad, during the time that lockdown happened. And so my background, I'm a brain health coach, so it was about me giving her the tools that would work for her, and you have to do it on an individual level quite often, that would work for her to help her through the trauma of losing her husband, because she witnessed it. So we can't forget the trauma associated with loss, as well as helping her through the grieving process. And that was, she's fine now. She has all of the tools in place that she needs, and she's sad, but she's happy, and she's able to cope with the loneliness. She's happy about being isolated, but it's about giving everyone those tools that work and are easy and simple to apply at every age group, that I think is key. Thank you.
Thank you. Kate, do we have other questions for the panel?
Yeah, we've got a good question from Hannah Mackey. So a general question to all the speakers: is there any work being done to reach people of all backgrounds? That's BAME communities, LGBTQ+ people, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, for example.
Rita, I think I can see you nodding. You're muted.
Yes. Would you like me to just say briefly? I mean, bearing in mind, we're working in a predominantly white area. You know, BAME is very much in the minority, but it is something that we are specifically concerned about and make sure we highlight. If I could just mention another project we're doing with Active Oxfordshire, we're actually working in South Abingdon, where targeting BAME is one of the criteria, and it's about encouraging people to stay fit and physically fit and healthy. On another note, we do have quite often we find mixed race young people, and that sense of identity, and within this COVID crisis, they have felt even more lonely and isolated. And we're working with them. We're actually working with them to connect with the police, because the perception of police within the BAME community, particularly the young Black community, can be very, very negative. And so, yes, it's absolutely making sure that if we have any BAME young people or elderly, they are supported and they feel part of everything that's going on.
Thank you. Paul, Andrew, Paul.
I was just going to add to that about the Aging Better programme, which is funded by the lottery. They put £150 million into an older people's programme called Aging Better in 14 areas, not including Oxfordshire, and I'm not bitter about that. But in those programmes, one in Leicester focused very much on the BAME groups for obvious reasons. And I'm also struck by the Opening Doors project in London for LGBT, and that has been very successful. And again, it's all about life-enhancing things. It's about giving people something that they will find joy in, find purpose in.
Thank you. Andrew, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I mean, in Banbury, we have the Banbury Brighter Futures, which tries to bring together the communities, the most disadvantaged communities, which in Banbury would be Grimsbury and Ruscott. And that's been very successful. One of the projects we've been rolling out there has been FAST, Families Active Sporting Together, trying to raise levels of activity. But one of the things that we've really found was successful was that after these activities, we would provide a light lunch. People would eat together. And it's that act of breaking bread almost together that it tends to bring people together and make them realize that there is, to quote what Paul said, there is more that unites us than separates us. Yeah.
Thank you. Kate, any quick final questions?
Yeah. So we should also say there's a lot of advice and support in the chat that people are giving to each other, which is great. We can share the whole chat with you afterwards. So if you haven't managed to catch those links and things, then we can share that with you so that you can have those. One probably final question on the subject of social prescribing. So Vivian Mills says, has Andrew come across the Froome project to reduce social isolation? They use social prescribers and a wide range of individuals to reduce that isolation. And she's leading a project called Connected Communities in Headington based on that Froome project.
I have come across that. I think that was a subject on the Sunday Times magazine a few months back. Am I right? It is. Is that right?
I've got a link to a very good PowerPoint that some people in the Froome project did, which looks at all of the research that they based it on. It was actually generated from local GPs here, and in Headington we're actually working with social prescribers, but they didn't actually generate the scheme. We're working with the CCG, Brookes University, local churches, a whole number of organisations. But basically they found that by being able to refer people who through the social prescribers have discovered were feeling very isolated for a whole range of reasons and a whole range of ages, actually admissions to hospitals were significantly down, both in Froome itself and with comparable places within that area. So it had a major impact, not just on people's well-being, but actually a financial impact, which if you're looking for funding is actually quite important.
The problem is that the benefits come 2 or 3 years down from the intervention, and it's trying to convince financial directors of local authorities to actually see that benefit now that will come out of this year's budget.
We've just put in an application for some funding from our council because I don't know if there are street champions throughout the area I'm talking to, but we have street champions in Oxford to see if we could take over the kind of management of them and use those as another way of getting access to people who had, it may be just the need which many people who are shielding at the moment have for things like shopping, but it actually might be also things like isolation, to try and coordinate that a bit more. But that, because that will require a little bit of staffing, we have asked for some funding. Whether we'll get it is another matter, of course, but we were going to have a really big launch of the project. There's a big festival in Headington every end of May, beginning of June, but unfortunately coronavirus put paid to that. It was going to be a really big outdoor event, but I mean it will happen at some point, you know, and we will try. And we've now got a Facebook page as well, so we are gradually, very gradually doing some of these things. But coronavirus has impacted in very practical ways on what we're doing, as well as the individual isolation of many people.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vivian. Do post a link to that report in the chat box, and then we can share it around and other people can access it. And I know Paul was waving a report around, so if you want to share details of that,
now while you're talking, okay.
Or if you send it to us afterwards, we can add it to the links that go out.
Right, okay.
We are just very quick, Paul.
I was just brandishing my copy of the book about Froome called The Compassion Project, which for a small fee I can share with anybody. I think social prescribing is a wonderful way forward. Let's not worry about the language, but social prescribers need all the skills necessary to make it work, lots of skills. They need really good information about what's out there, and they need things out there they can refer to. And I come back to this issue of access, because unless we tackle physical access through transport or digital access, we're not going to be able to connect people with that social prescription.
Thank you, Paul. And on that, we are going to have to bring it to a close, but we will be picking up a lot of the issues we've mentioned today. Digital access, BAME communities are certainly on the agenda for the next few months' webinars. Next webinar will be on 24th of February, when I fear, given announcements today, we're still going to be under lockdown. And we are going to be looking at facing the economic impact of COVID and the lockdowns, which I think we're still only starting to see what those economic impacts are. But please do join us then. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.